This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan, and in for Amy J. this morning, John Cass of the Chicago Tribune. And obviously the California wildfires and the death and destruction they have wrought have somewhat muted our discussion of that horrific shooting at the country bar in Thousand Oaks, California. That mass shooting combined with a change in the balance of power, both at the federal level and at a lot of state levels. Democrats picking up half a dozen governorships, about a half a dozen state legislative chambers, in addition to, of course, Speaker Pelosi over the top in the House. What does that mean for two-way rights? Where are the Democrats going to go after spending a lot of the money that Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg cobbled together for them, casting conservative Republicans, all Republicans really, as
mass murderers.
Well, at least as sympathetic to school shooters and the like.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw those commercials here throughout the Chicagoland area against Ruscom and Holmgren, and even at the state legislative level. For more on that topic, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend John Lott, Jr., president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, the author of a number of books, including The War on Guns and More Guns, Less Crime. John, thanks for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Good to talk to you both.
So to my question, I opened with the balance of power and what that means for Second Amendment rights.
I mean, I'm sure you're right. The Wall Street Journal had a large article over the weekend about different plans in the states where Democrats have taken over state legislatures or gotten governorships or obviously Congress. Where they're planning some of the first bills that they're going to put out at the beginning of the year are going to be new gun control bills. I just wish they would do something that was actually relevant to the types of attacks that have, gotten people upset, as they should. They want to go and push for universal background checks. I mean, I guess I would just ask, can you point to one mass public shooting this century that would have been stopped if those laws had been in effect and had been effective? There's not one. They want to talk about banning certain types of semi-automatic guns based upon how they look. We've tried that. We've done that. Different states do that. There's been lots of academic research on that. You just don't see a benefit from it. But, on the other hand, here we have yet another mass public shooting this last week in California, which is at yet another gun-free zone. If you're a concealed carry permit holder in California, California is one of the 11 states that ban concealed carry permit holders from carrying in places like bars, whether they drink or not. People kind of poo-poo the president's comments after the synagogue massacre in Pittsburgh, but the one again, you had another place that didn't have anybody with guns. They essentially banned any of the congregants from being able to go and have guns. They had security guards at high holidays, but the rest of the year they didn't have protection there because of financial obligations. The one thing that would be important in these cases is to have somebody there quickly to go and stop these attackers. And, when you're talking about issues like mental illness or what have you that we're focused on, we have yet another attack this last week in California where the person had previously seen a mental health care professional who had decided that the person was not a danger to himself or others. Over 60% of the mass public shootings in the last 20 years, the people were actually seeing mental health care professionals within at least just a few months of the attack. And in none of those cases was the killer identified as a danger to themselves or others.
Is there something wrong? Is there something wrong with the reporting, with the approach that mental health professionals take?
Well, it's just very hard to go and identify these individuals. People with mental illness on average tend to be less violent than the general population. They also tend to be more likely to be victims of violent crime. And there's a whole academic literature that exists there in psychology and psychiatry about how difficult it is when you're talking about just, an incredibly tiny number. So you look at schizophrenia. There are about 2.5 million people that have schizophrenia in the country. You're talking about, over the last 20 years, 2 people, even broadly, could have been defined as having schizophrenia who engaged in these attacks. You look at other types of mental illness. You're talking about really tiny percentages that are involved that do these things, and it's just so small. The mental health care people say that they just aren't very good at identifying these people. They're the first ones to admit it, that they have an extremely difficult job and not very accurate in identifying these people.
What about red flag laws? We've had those proposed. They sound good. Maybe they would be effective in certain instances, but there appear to be some pitfalls too. There was a case in Maryland last week that we discussed where a neighbor called the police on his neighbor. They show up to serve him with a warrant to search the house, remove the guns, and he gets into an altercation with police with a gun. This individual handled it as badly as you could handle it and put the police in jeopardy. So this is not blaming the police, and maybe the neighbor was right, but to call the police on this guy. But there was no criminal history that has been reported. Police initiate, and it winds up with this guy being killed. If the context was a little bit different, and perhaps the racial composition of the participants a little bit different, the story would probably get a lot of different coverage. And so the red flag laws, where you turn people into civilian police, as it were.
Look, you already can take away guns from people, but you have to in most states and in the past, you've had to go through a legal process where there's a hearing and evidence is presented. What the red flag laws do is it makes it so you don't have to have that type of hearing, that you don't have to have mental health care experts be involved in the process at all. But, here's some of my concerns with regard to beyond kind of the due process issues. And that is, if you really believe that somebody's a danger to themselves or others, you really ought to consider involuntarily committing them. Simply going and taking away their legal guns isn't a serious response. I mean, let's put it this way. We ban illegal drugs. Do you believe that people can't get those if they want to get them? And the same source for illegal drugs, the drug dealers are sources for illegal guns. The drug dealers are the major source of illegal guns. And so, if you really think that the guy is a danger, just saying we're going to take away your legal guns is no more serious than saying we're going to stop you from getting drugs by making them illegal. And the thing is also, there's so many different types of ways that people can harm others. Are you going to include taking away the driver's license from people? Because they could go and drive a car down the sidewalk in Chicago and kill people if they're really going to do this. Why only focus on guns here? But in the couple of times where people have tried to put amendments on these red flag laws that would go and try to make them take away other things like their driving privileges or something like that, or to go and try to set up a process for them being involuntarily committed, the proponents of these red flag laws will fight vigorously against any of those types of things.
You've been on this show and others in Chicago talking about this subject. But I remember years ago, you were run out of town. You were in Chicago, teaching at the University of Chicago. You were run out of town by Rich Daley. Is that my take on that? Is that correct?
Yeah, it was an interesting story. I was at the University of Chicago Law School. I had a visiting position there. My book, More Guns, Less Crime, came out in May 1998. And in November 1998, Mayor Daley called up Hugo Sonnenschein, who was the president of the University of Chicago at the time, and went through all the wonderful things that the city wanted to do with the school. And at the end of the conversation, though, he said that Lott's continued presence at the University of Chicago was going to do, quote, irreparable harm between the relationship between the city and the school. And 2 days later, I get called into the dean's office. He apologizes for having to have me in there, but said that the president of the university wants me out because of the damage that because I've been doing media a lot that year when my book came out. I mean, it was a University of Chicago press book of all ironies. And I won't go through the whole details, but basically, because they wanted me to leave. They paid me through the rest of the year, but they wanted to end my affiliation with the university immediately.
Yeah.
And the deal we worked out was that I'd promised not to talk to the press for the remaining of the academic year. In exchange, they'd let me stay around. And so if you kind of look that year, I basically stopped doing media in November. You know, it's like cold stop. Radio silent. And but I kept on getting calls from the Wall Street Journal like every few weeks. Max Boot would call me up. And so finally in March, I started writing some op-eds. But I figured, would they really, like with 2 months to go, fire me because I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal? I convinced myself. But anyway, I was gone. I ended up going to Yale Law School after that. But, you know, anyway, I could.
Yeah, well,
anyway,
it's nice to know Chicago believes in freedom of speech.
Hey, look, it's when we finally got rid of John Lott, all our problems went away, and Chicago's become the safest city in the country, as everybody knows. John, you know, I'm sorry we had to do it.
I'm glad I could help out on that.
Yeah. He is John Lott Jr. Great story about how the Chicago way, Chicago, the city that works and all that. John Lott Jr., president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, author of a number of books. We're not afraid to say on the air. The War on Guns, More Guns, Less Crime. John, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being there. Thanks.
And join us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
This is the